Hey guys, happy Monday. Hope all is well. This video is going to be another installment in the series I started a little while back called Chess Secrets You Wish You Knew. There are a lot of sort of nuances that are part of the game that aren't always explicitly talked about, and I want to explore another one here. This video is going to be essentially about thinking twice before you trade a bishop for a knight. I see it all the time across all levels, all the way up from total beginner to GM, about trading where one side gives up their bishop for a knight, and it has dire consequences. And it was something that I actually learned on the road to becoming a 2200 player, because what I would do a lot of the times is I would get rid of my light squared bishop, and because typically in many openings that I played, the light squared bishop was sort of a bad bishop or sort of tricky to develop. And so I thought that by just getting it out of the chain, out of my pawn chain, and not having bad pieces, and getting rid of that it would be okay and I could weather the storm. And what I learned is that trading a bishop, even the one that you don't think is great, does have consequences. And so I just wanted to illustrate some games I'd seen just this week that had sort of demonstrated that. So the first game I'm going to look at is a game between a talented German player, Rasmus Svane, and this other guy. I'm not going to even try to pronounce his name, Mikhailo. And yeah, just look at the situation. So d4, d5. A lot of the scenarios that happen in d4 openings, because the play is a little bit more protracted, and there's usually knight-bishop tension early on in these lines. But anyways, this is a Slav, a Schlechter Slav with g6, knight f3 and g6. And bishop g7, bishop e2, castles. Hold on, I'm going to charge my laptop really quickly, get this thing in there. And then d takes c4. This is actually a first mistake in my opinion, because it's really not a great idea to relieve the tension in the center and give white a little bit more control. But you can see the idea is that after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, black elects to play bishop g4. And the point is, okay, now after bishop g4, the idea is that now the knight can go to d7, and the black bishop on c8 won't be essentially getting in the way of the rooks getting connected, and just sort of not getting it has a purpose at least. But the thing is that after the simple h3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, black gave up the bishop pair, and for what? That's the real question. Well, the point is, as I just said, essentially black is sort of forfeiting the bishop pair to not have any bad pieces. So there's knight bd7, and now it's clear that black's actually revving up to play e5. And it looks like black's is closer to getting the rooks connected, not having bad pieces. Maybe the bishop on g7 is on the long diagonal, sort of creating some decent pressure. But the really more important thing to think is the idea with taking on f3 and sort of expanding in the middle is extremely double-edged. And the reason for it is white has the bishop pair, and as soon as black's activity is nullified, all of a sudden it's white that will have all the long-term trumps. So it's really a very much of a short-term idea to give up the bishop pair for a little bit of activity in the short term. And then if white is able to weather that storm, real trouble for black. And we can see that actually it comes to actually happen here. Because after rook d1, excellent move, lining the rook up against the black queen on d8, e5, d5, very important, not playing d takes e5, which would black would play knight takes e5, hitting the queen and the bishop on c4. After d takes e5, knight takes e5, the queen would have to go back to e2 because it's knight takes f3 check. And after queen e2, this queen could probably move, and black still has some pretty decent activity because maybe queen b6, maybe even just queen e7 is good enough. And the point is that black has really good activity here, and white still needs a few more moves to play bishop d2 and bishop e1, and play bishop b3 to keep the bishop pair. And maybe black's just not in time, or white's not in time, because if you play a move like bishop b3 here, now black can go rook d8, And okay, after bishop d2, there's knight d3, which hits the pawn on b2 and just sort of preserves black's ideas for activity. So the point is that after d5, you sort of cut out those ideas. And again, black is insistent on playing in the short term because if the two bishops become a long-term trump, then it'll be a problem. So black is trying to get this activity in and decides to play e4. And it's a very interesting tactical move because the point is that if white takes on e4 with the pawn, with the knight, if white takes on e4, if white's knight takes on e4 then the d5 pawn will be hanging. But he does it anyway because after knight takes e4, knight takes, queen takes, knight b6, and then queen c2, very important move. Black is faced with a choice. Either give white a pawn-up advantage or give white the two bishops. Now, the pawn-up advantage would be knight takes c4. After knight takes c4, queen takes c4, e takes d5, queen takes d5. Well, it's clear that that white is the one that's better. Actually, maybe rook takes d5 is a little bit better, actually. Just sort of preserving control of the file. And white is a little bit better here. White is up a pawn. And black might have a tiny bit of compensation with the bishop on the long diagonal, but white must be better here. And so instead of that, black elected to play, after queen c2, play c takes d5. And, well, we know how the story goes. The bishop went back to e2, a very brilliant move. Not going to b3 because then there would be rook c8, and then maybe the queen moves somewhere like e2. And then one day the knight might just come to c4, cutting out the bishop for a little while. So bishop e2 was a little bit more clever because after bishop e2, the bishop will relocate to f3, where it's relatively unchallenged by the knight on b6, and has a whole new diagonal to work with on f3. Very, very excellent move. And the issue is after bishop e2, rook c8, queen b3, well, the activity is pretty much gone. Black's activity as far as getting some initiative and pressing that through really just didn't work out. And we have a position now where white clearly has the two bishops, slightly better pawn structure. Also, the b7 pawn is a little bit loose, and so the knight can't really move. The d5 pawn is loose, and it just advantage white. And you see it all the time where black sort of gives up the bishop pair for this a sort of temporary activity, but if white's able to nullify it, it's just long-term suffering for black. Let me show another example of just this problem. And by the way, Rasmus went on to win this game. Let me show another example of this issue. This game is a game from the Polish Championship that's, I think, still going on. And just another really, really critical example. In this game, Grzegorz Gajewski, very, very strong Polish player, really sort of got a nice advantage based on similar themes. So after d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, d5, castles, knight bd2, we get a little bit of an unorthodox position. It's sort of like a fianchettoed Grunfeld, but white is delayed playing c4. And this is sort of a different type of position because now black has the opportunity to break in the middle first, and he does by playing c5. But I think Gajewski wanted this because he wanted to play in a little bit more of a dynamic way and try and let black take control of the center, and then play the opening like a sort of like a black player with a tempo up, which is an interesting way of handling the opening. But anyways, d takes c5. Queen c7, it seems logical, trying to recover the c5 pawn. Knight b3, insisting on protecting it. And then e5, very, very interesting move. The point is just sort of to take control of the middle. At least if black might not get the pawn back on c5 right away, but just going to try and get something dynamic going in the middle at first. And then Gajewski, this must have been preparation because it's a really interesting way to play. He played e4. Which seems like it doesn't make any sense because the pawn can be captured twice. But essentially the gist of this idea is that if knight takes e4, there's queen takes d5, so that's sort of out of the question because black would lose one of the central pawns and not win it, and the knight would still be attacked here. So there wouldn't even be a winning material here for black. And then if d takes e4, I think the idea was just knight g5, essentially to just attack the e4 pawn this way and eventually recover the pawn. Unfortunately, d takes e4 was not what should have been played and was not played by Gajewski's opponent Jacek, who was probably afraid of walking into some more deep preparation, and instead played bishop g4, which, again, there's this impulse in a lot of d4 openings to just play the bishop to g4, pin a knight, and say, I have no bad pieces. And look just how badly this goes awry. While Gajewski says, okay, fine, you're going to go bishop g4, I'm just going to go h3. Just try and go for your bishop. And after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, we have another scenario where white has the two bishops. And if black, as soon as black's activity sort of is diminished, there's going to be some issues. And so let's see here. Now this e4 pawn is still attacked twice. And if there is d takes e4, this was not played, white can just go back with queen e2 and recover the e4 pawn pretty much whenever he wants. So, and then maybe this whole diagonal might be open. So white might play a move like bishop g5 next, and then take on e4 with the queen or the bishop and preserve pressure on this long diagonal. So to illustrate that, let's say like knight a6 trying to recover the c5 pawn. Maybe there's just maybe there's just bishop e3 protecting the pawn, or even if knight c6, maybe there's c3 first covering the d4 square, and then like let's say rook d8, then there's bishop g5, and then an eventual capture on f6, take on e4, and white is still a clear pawn up. So d takes e4 wasn't played, but black played knight takes e4, which really doesn't make sense either, and because now the material is equal, but white has the two bishops and a very, very stunning and spectacular undermining move here, which Gajewski finds immediately. Rook d1, first attacking the d5 pawn. Again, now it's a real problem defending that. And then after rook d8, defending that pawn, c4. And all of a sudden, you can see that the center is unraveling, and this bishop on g2 and this queen on e4 and the rook on d1 are all just putting immense pressure on the center. And just to illustrate how dire it could be, knight a6 was played, and then c takes d5. White's clearly has the upper hand here because he has the two bishops, a lot of activity, and yeah, it's just not going to be pretty. But if black did go for d takes c4, that wouldn't really solve a whole lot of issues either, because there'd be rook takes d8 check, queen takes d8, and queen takes e4. And although black would recover get a piece back after c takes b3 and a takes b3, white is still significantly better because of the two bishops. It's just something that cannot be understated. The two bishops just absolutely rule in this position. Yeah, and the material's equal, b7 is weak. All these factors lead to advantage white. And you see it time and time again, where, again, the bishop takes the knight on f3, and then it's a short-term activity, and then white just busts it open in a bad way. And so let's see some of this game, actually, because this maybe is still a little bit tactically complicated, and you might not see where it's going. So knight a6 was played, c takes d5. Now white's still a pawn up, so black's going to take on c5 now. Knight takes, then knight takes, and now, again, the material's equal now. White has the two bishops and a passed pawn on d5. You might say, oh, black can maybe blockade on the light squares. Excuse me, on the dark squares, and sort of set up a nice dark square blockade. That can be tried, but Gajewski's really, really strong and plays some very precise moves here. First playing bishop g5, hitting this rook on d8, developing with tempo, very critical, because now white's rook can come to c1, the a rook can come to c1 with tempo. So after rook d7, then again another amazing move, bishop e7, super strong, which in fact now rook takes e7 is impossible because of d6. And really what this does bishop e7 is it sort of forces white, it allows white to get in d6 tactically, without black really being able to do anything about it. So in fact, after bishop g5, black should have probably gone rook d6 to sort of firmly hold this blockading square this way. But again, I could see why that wasn't entertained, because you're not going to be able to hold this blockade for long. After a move like rook a c1, already b4 is a serious threat, and well, bishop e7 might come anyway. So there's not really going to be some way to tactically hold this position, because if you played like queen b6 to get out the pin, well, now bishop e7 is coming again. Oh, excuse me, not queen g4. Bishop e7 is coming again, and it's actually hitting the rook with tempo. So, yeah, just a brilliant sort of way of developing. And after this, after bishop g5, rook d7, bishop e7, the game's pretty much over. I mean, there's plenty of moves left, and okay, it's not losing for black just yet, but white is so much better here with the passed pawn, 2 bishops, and that's just overwhelming advantage. And it really did not turn well. Queen b6 was played, then d6, then the diagonals totally opened up for the bishop on g2, which was looking kind of dormant after with the d5 pawn there. And yeah, bishop f8, he tried to sort of corral things, but too much activity for white. And eventually, with the 2 bishops, what normally happens is you give up you might give up a bishop to transform the advantage. And here the advantage is just transformed. White's a pawn down, but all the pieces are activated, and he's going to get his pawn back relatively quickly. And this is what happened. And, okay, maybe Gajewski didn't play perfectly, but managed to convert this advantage pretty easily because, again, the knight on a6 is wayward, White's rooks are super active, and the bishop on g2 is just doing a lot of work. And note that all of black's pawns are on light squares, which makes them ripe targets. So this was 1-0 for white. Now, the last example I'm going to show, because I love to give examples, this doesn't just happen in sort of d4, d5 type of openings. It also happens in other lines, like in the King's Indian. And so I'm going to show a game in a King's Indian Samish where this happened, because it happens in some of the dynamic openings too. So in this game, Wang Hao was playing. He's a very strong player. He was like 2750. I don't know where he is now, but anyways, a King's Indian ensues. There's a Samish variation with bishop f3 and bishop e3. And then c5, this pawn sacrifice, I never liked to play it myself with black because I just thought that it was very difficult to prove the compensation if white knew what they were doing. Or at least it was very difficult to try and win the game with this pawn sacrifice, because white gets an endgame immediately with the queens off and a pawn up. And black can sort of get black definitely has compensation, but I didn't think it was anything more than that. And it was a bit tough to press beyond a draw. So, anyways, bishop takes e5, knight c6, bishop e3, this is all theory, b6, rook c1, bishop a6, and all these moves have been played before, I'm sure of that, and knight h3. And the point in these lines, actually, of the Samish, when black is playing this way with c5, and going for this endgame, is trying to sort of prove that the activity is worth the pawn. That the pressure on these dark squares, specifically d4, e5, and b4, will be enough to sort of create enough activity where the extra queenside pawn for white will not be too difficult to deal with. But if you don't prove that compensation, then you're just a pawn down. And I think Wang Hao's opponent panicked, because after rook a8, knight f2, e6, bishop e2, knight b4, and b3, it looks like white has sort of covered all of the bases. And again, now after b3, the bishop on a6 is a little bit shut out. The knight on b4 doesn't have a target yet. d3 is effectively covered. White can't even everything is protected in white's camp. And now Black sort of panicked and decided to make some really irrational decisions to sort of ensure that he had the compensation. But instead of playing for compensation, he decided to try and get the pawn back. And you see this sometimes when you've been sort of playing in a way where you get trying to get the initiative, and then you're not sure how the initiative can be continued, so you go for just getting the pawn that you sacrificed, and you squander your control in a way that's irreparable. And this is what happened in 2 moves. After knight d7, unlocking the bishop on g7, white just castled. Okay, whatever, big deal. And black sipped the Kool-Aid. Black said, oh, I can win this pawn back, and I guess I won't be that bad because I got my pawn back, which is sort of the goal, right, to get this compensation to win a pawn. And he played probably the worst move in the position that doesn't just blunder a piece, which is bishop takes c3. And you might say, well, you're getting a pawn back after rook takes c3, knight takes a2, and then rook c2. What's the harm done in this position? Well, all you need to do is look at all of those dark squares on the king side where that bishop on g7 was once controlling, because now it looks like Swiss cheese. e7, f6, g7, and h6. They all look like Swiss cheese. That's what I call it, just weaknesses galore. And almost immediately, white is able to take advantage of this. So despite the equal position, now the 2 bishops, and particularly the dark squared bishop on e3, will reign supreme. And just look how quickly it ends. It ends in 10 moves. Knight b4, the knight had to be moved. Rook d2, immediately centralizing. Knight c5, trying to win the b3 pawn, but Wang Hao sees deeper and says, I don't need to defend this pawn. I need to centralize now. I got the 2 bishops, and I see weak squares on the king side to work with. And already here, it's a real problem, because if rook takes d2 is played, well, there's, for starters, bishop takes d2, and this knight on b4 is very loose, and if knight goes to c6, there's just b4, and then after b5 next. So the b3 pawn isn't even hanging. And so because of this nuance, black has to go back to e8 and cede the file, and then it's just infiltration time. Knight g4, hitting those weak squares the bishop just managed to leave. King g7 doesn't really solve anything, because now bishop h6 comes, and the knight forces its way in anyway. And yeah, now the game is totally lost. I mean, the rook on e8 is a goner. There's no way where it can go, where it can save itself. If you go to e7, there's rook d8 with, not rook d7, but rook d8 with mate to follow. So there's really just no scenario where black's getting out of this. And it's just amazing that this position went so downhill so quickly because of the exchange of the bishops. Or not the exchange of the bishop, the exchange of a bishop by black in a position where it wasn't warranted. So again, when you're playing and when you're thinking about exchanges, always think twice about trading that bishop for the knight. If it just nets you a pawn, or if you think your justification is that it's ensuring that you don't have any bad pieces. Really make sure that that the interim you're going to be able to survive and withstand almost the inevitable pressure that will come about if you allow your opponent to get the 2 bishops and work with that. I could show even more examples, but I'll leave it here. Really think twice about giving up that bishop for the knight just so you don't have any bad pieces. Because I've seen some of the worst bishops be better than some of the decent knights. Some of the knights you thought were okay, I've seen are actually worse than the worst bishop. And yeah, so keep that in your mind. And I will say this: I was 2100, and I kept losing. I kept losing to people stronger than me, like 2400s, 2500s, and I was playing a lot of Slavs. So just to illustrate that, actually, I'll just show you. I was playing a lot of positions where it'd be like d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, e3, and bishop g4. And I was doing this a lot. And my justification was, well, and then they played h3, and then I'd say, oh, after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and e6, I have no bad pieces. My bishop on f8 can develop to a nice square. And now my bishop on c8 is not blocked by my pawn e6, and I'm fine. And I kept losing games because over time, the long term, if I didn't actually do anything and didn't get any real activity going, over time, the long term trumps that were the two bishops would continuously destroy me. And this light squared bishop on f1 would always do work. And so even though white might be slightly underdeveloped and have this, and it seems like you might be able to get a pawn break in like e5 or knight bd7 and e5 or d takes c4 and c5. As soon as that pawn tension was resolved and it appeared that white sort of weathered the storm, I'd be screwed. And then I realized, you know what? I'm going to hold off on giving my light squared bishop on c8 to white every single time. And it was a real sort of eureka moment, epiphany moment, whatever you want to call it. And soon after that, I made master. So think about it. All right, guys. Thanks for watching.